Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was curled in the fetal position inside a 4-foot sphere of aluminum and plexiglass, 23,000 feet above the Bay of Biscay, when the 20mm cannon shell punched through the radio compartment of his B-17 and ignited 200 gallons of aviation fuel. It was 11:07 in the morning on May 1st, 1943. Smith had been a combat gunner for exactly 42 minutes. What happened in the next 90 would make him the first enlisted airman in the European theatre to receive the Medal of Honor, and it would fundamentally change how the 8th Air Force thought about courage under fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The explosion came without warning. One moment, Smith was scanning the sky below his bomber for German fighters, his hands resting on the twin 50-caliber machine guns that protruded from his Sperry ball turret. The next moment, something slammed into the aircraft with enough force to knock his turret off its electrical power. The intercom went dead, the hydraulics failed, and through the small porthole window above his head, Smith could see orange flames crawling across the ceiling of the radio compartment. He was 32 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighed 138 pounds. His fellow crew members called him Snuffy, though never to his face with any warmth. The nickname came from the comic strip character Snuffy Smith, a lazy hillbilly who avoided work and responsibility. Smith had earned the comparison over 6 weeks at Thurleigh Air Base in England, where he had developed a reputation as the man nobody wanted to fly with. The flames were spreading faster than Smith could process what was happening. His ball turret hung from the belly of the B-17, suspended in open air beneath the fuselage. To exit the turret, Smith had to rotate the sphere until the hatch aligned with the opening in the aircraft's floor, then squeeze himself up through a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. Under normal conditions, this took about 15 seconds. With the turret's power out and fire spreading through the compartment above him, those 15 seconds felt like eternity. He cranked the manual rotation handle, forcing the turret to turn against its own dead weight. His breath fogged the inside of his oxygen mask. The temperature at altitude was 40 below zero, but heat from the fire above was already radiating down through the fuselage floor. The turret aligned. Smith grabbed the hatch rim, pulled himself up, and emerged into hell. The Saint-Nazaire mission had started badly and gotten worse. 78 B-17 seconds from 4 different bomb groups were supposed to rendezvous over England before flying south across the English Channel to hit the German submarine pens on the French coast. The pens were concrete structures built into the waterfront, designed to protect U-boats while they loaded torpedoes and refueled between patrols. Allied planners considered them priority targets. German defenders knew this, which was why they had ringed Saint-Nazaire with enough anti-aircraft guns to earn it the nickname Flak City among American air crews. The rendezvous went wrong from the start. 20 bombers failed to meet the formation at the designated coordinates and had to race to catch up, burning extra fuel and straining their engines. 5 of those 20 developed mechanical problems from the stress and turned back. 6 more bombers returned to base with engine trouble before crossing the English coast. Then, the weather closed in. A thick cloud bank rolled across their flight path just as the formation crossed into French airspace. The lead navigator made a decision to climb above it, but visibility dropped to 0. When the formation finally broke through the clouds, 38 pilots took one look at the weather ahead and made the calculation that they couldn't maintain formation in those conditions. They peeled off and headed back to England. That left 29 B-17 seconds to attack the most heavily defended target on the Atlantic coast. 29 bombers, where there should have been 78, less than 40% of the planned strike force. But the mission commander gave the order to proceed, and 29 bombers continued south towards Saint-Nazaire. Lieutenant Louis Page Johnson was piloting one of those 29 aircraft. He was 24 years old, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and this was supposed to be his last combat mission. He had completed 24 previous trips over occupied Europe, and one more would finish his tour of duty. After this flight, he could go home. Johnson was careful about everything. He never painted nose art on his bomber, never gave it a nickname, never did anything that might attract attention from German fighter pilots who liked to target distinctive aircraft. Johnson's crew consisted of 9 other men. 8 of them were veterans who had flown multiple missions together and knew each other's rhythms in combat. The 9th was Maynard Smith, who had been in England for 6 weeks and had never seen action because nobody would fly with him. Smith's problem wasn't competence. He had graduated from aerial gunnery school at Harlingen Army Airfield in Texas with satisfactory marks. He could field strip and reassemble a 50 caliber Browning machine gun blindfolded while wearing heavy gloves. He knew his turret systems. He could identify German fighter aircraft from silhouettes. On paper, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was qualified for combat operations. His problem was personality. Smith had been born into a wealthy family in Cairo, Michigan, where his father served as a circuit judge. The family had money, education, and social standing. Smith inherited the confidence that came with that background, but somewhere along the way, he developed an inflated sense of his own importance that made him insufferable to be around. His parents, recognizing this problem, sent him to military academy, hoping the discipline would fix him. It didn't. After his father died, Smith quit his job as a tax collector and moved back home with his mother. He lived on his inheritance and spent his time giving unsolicited lectures to anyone who would listen about politics, philosophy, and how the world should operate. This habit eventually got him in trouble with local authorities. Facing potential jail time for disturbing the peace, Smith enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, figuring military service would keep him out of legal trouble. The Army Air Forces needed gunners badly in early 1943. Bomber losses over Europe were mounting, and replacement crew members were in short supply. Smith volunteered for gunnery school because it offered quick promotion to sergeant and a higher pay. His small size made him ideal for ball turret duty, where the cramped quarters eliminated most candidates over 5'7". He arrived at Thurleigh Air Base in March 1943 and immediately made himself unpopular. He contradicted officers during briefings. He lectured other enlisted men about their mistakes. He spent his off-duty time in local pubs, sharing his opinions with anyone within earshot. His fellow airmen started calling him Snuffy and sometimes Sad Sack. The nicknames were meant as insults. Smith didn't care or didn't notice. For 6 weeks, Smith watched other men fly combat missions while he remained grounded. Every time a crew needed a ball turret gunner, they requested anyone except Smith. Even understaffed crews found ways to fly without him. He was competent enough that nobody could justify removing him from flight status, but nobody wanted to trust their lives to a man who couldn't shut up long enough to listen. On April 30th, Lieutenant Johnson's regular ball turret gunner came down with flu symptoms severe enough to ground him. The mission to Saint-Nazaire was scheduled for the next morning. Johnson needed a replacement gunner immediately. Every other qualified ball turret operator in the 306th Bomb Group was either flying with another crew or medically unfit. That left Smith. Johnson drew the short straw. The briefing for the Saint-Nazaire mission happened at 0400 hours on May 1st. 147 men crowded into the briefing room and watched as an intelligence officer pulled back a curtain to reveal a large map of Western Europe. A red line traced their route from Thurleigh south across the English Channel, over Brittany, to Saint-Nazaire on the coast. The intelligence officer explained that they would bomb the submarine pens from 23,000 feet, well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns. German fighter opposition was expected to be moderate, since most Luftwaffe units had been pulled back to defend Germany proper. The men groaned anyway. They knew Saint-Nazaire's reputation. After the briefing, Smith collected his 50 caliber machine guns from the armament shop, where they had been cleaned and oiled overnight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He rode in a truck with the rest of Johnson's crew to their aircraft, a B-17 F Flying Fortress with the serial number 42-29649. The plane had no name, no nose art, nothing to distinguish it from dozens of other bombers on the flight line. That was how Johnson wanted it. Smith climbed through the belly hatch and into his ball turret, while the rest of the crew completed their pre-flight checks. The turret was a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of ergonomics. A sphere roughly 4 feet in diameter, it contained 2 50 caliber machine guns, a reflector sight, ammunition feeds, the gunner's seat, and just barely enough room for a small man to curl up with his knees near his chest and his feet resting on stirrups. The gunner sat with his back to the rear of the aircraft, looking down and out through the plexiglass panels. Once inside, Smith was completely isolated from the rest of the crew. He couldn't stand up, couldn't stretch out, couldn't move more than a few inches in any direction. Everything he needed for the mission had to be within arm's reach before he sealed the hatch. The turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from vertical to nearly horizontal, giving Smith coverage of the entire underside of the aircraft and most of the sides. German fighters attacking from below would have to get past his guns first. The B-17 engines fired up at 0530. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, enough combined power to lift 65,000 pounds into the air and carry it 600 miles into enemy territory. The bomber taxied to the runway, lined up behind the other aircraft in the strike force, and waited for takeoff clearance. At 0552, Johnson released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The B-17 rolled down the runway, picked up speed, and lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness. They climbed in a slow spiral over Thurleigh, gaining altitude while waiting for the other bombers to form up. By the time they levelled off at 23,000 feet, the sun was rising over the English countryside, and 77 other B-17 seconds were supposed to be flying in formation around them. They weren't. The missing bombers weren't coming back. The formation that should have numbered 78 aircraft now consisted of 29 B-17 seconds, flying in a loose combat box formation toward one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied France. Every pilot in that formation knew the odds had just gotten worse. The combat box was a tactical formation developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay to maximize defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. Aircraft flew in staggered positions at different altitudes, close enough that their machine guns created overlapping fields of fire, but far enough apart to avoid collisions. When German fighters attacked, they faced not just the guns of one bomber, but a coordinated wall of 50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. The formation worked brilliantly when you had 78 bombers. With 29, there were gaps. Smith couldn't see any of this from his ball turret position. His view consisted of sky, ocean, and the underside of the B-17 formation above him. The intercom crackled occasionally with position reports from the navigator, but mostly the flight was quiet. They crossed the English Channel at 0715 and entered French airspace at 0732. No German fighters appeared. The cloud deck below them hid the ground. At 0840, they reached the initial point for their bomb run, the geographic coordinates where the bombardier would take control of the aircraft through his Norden bomb site. The formation straightened out onto the final approach heading. The bomb bay doors opened. Cold air rushed through the interior of every B-17, dropping the temperature even further. Smith rotated his turret, scanning for fighters. Nothing. Just clouds below and empty sky on all sides. Maybe the intelligence briefing had been right. Maybe the Germans had pulled their fighters back. Maybe this mission would be easy. The formation dropped their bombs at 0903 from 23,000 feet. 232 500-pound bombs fell toward the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire. From that altitude, the crews couldn't see the impact. They released their loads, closed their bomb bay doors, and turned northwest toward the Atlantic Ocean and the long flight home to England. That was when the weather broke. The cloud bank that had hidden the formation during their approach suddenly ended. The bombers emerged into clear air, and every German anti-aircraft battery in Saint-Nazaire got a perfect view of 29 B-17 seconds flying in formation at 23,000 feet. The flak came up in curtains. Black puffs of smoke appeared in geometric patterns around the formation as German 88mm guns fired proximity-fused shells designed to explode near aircraft and send shrapnel through their aluminum and skin. The concussions rocked the bombers. Shrapnel pinged off metal. One B-17 took a direct hit in the wing and dropped out of formation, trailing smoke. Smith heard the flak bursts but couldn't see them from his position. He only knew the aircraft was taking evasive action because Johnson was banking hard, causing the ball turret to swing on its mount. The intercom stayed silent. Either the crew was too busy to talk or the communications system had taken damage. The formation made it past Saint-Nazaire and out over the Atlantic. The flak stopped. The bombers levelled off and began the long flight back to England. Smith started to relax. They had survived the target run. The worst was over. But the lead navigator made a mistake. Instead of flying due west out over the Atlantic before turning north toward England, the navigator turned north too early. The formation was still over the Brittany Peninsula, and their flight path took them directly toward Brest, another heavily fortified German naval base with its own complement of anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons. The Germans at Brest had been listening to radio reports from Saint-Nazaire. They knew American bombers were in the area. When 29 B-17 seconds appeared in their airspace, flying at reduced altitude after their evasive maneuvers, the Brest defenders launched everything they had. 20 Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s scrambled from Brest-Guipavas airfield. The pilots formed up into attack elements and climbed to intercept the American formation. They had altitude advantage, sun position in their favor, and orders to stop the bombers before they could escape over the ocean. Smith saw them coming from his ball turret position, dark crosses growing larger against the blue sky. Multiple fighters approaching from 4 o'clock low, exactly the attack angle his turret was designed to defend against. He grabbed the control handles, rotated the turret to track the lead fighter, and waited for them to close within range. The lead German pilot opened fire at 800 yards with 20mm cannons. Most of the rounds fell short, but a few found their mark. Smith heard impacts along the B-17's fuselage. He returned fire with his twin 50s, sending tracer rounds toward the attacking fighter. The German pilot broke left to avoid the defensive fire and climbed for another pass. More fighters appeared. The formation was under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Smith tracked targets as fast as his turret could rotate, firing controlled bursts, trying to force the German pilots to break off their attacks before they could get accurate shots at the B-17. Then something hit hard. The 20mm cannon shell that struck Johnson's aircraft entered through the radio compartment and detonated inside the fuselage. The explosion ruptured fuel lines running along the interior wall. Aviation fuel sprayed across hot metal and ignited immediately. Within seconds, fire spread through the radio compartment and back into the waist section where the side gunners operated. The blast knocked out electrical power to Smith's ball turret. His guns went silent. The turret rotation stopped working. The intercom cut to static. He was trapped in a dead sphere hanging from a burning aircraft, 23,000 feet above hostile territory, with no way to communicate and no way to know if the rest of the crew was alive or dead. Smith made a decision. He cranked the manual rotation handle, forcing the turret to align with the entry hatch through sheer physical effort. Every rotation of the handle moved the turret a few degrees. He counted turns, estimated position, hoped he was lining up correctly. When he thought he had the hatch aligned, he released the latch and pulled himself up through the opening. Heat hit him like a physical blow. The interior of the B-17 was on fire. Flames covered the radio compartment ceiling and were spreading aft toward the tail section. Smoke filled the fuselage, thick and black and choking. The temperature at altitude should have been 40 below zero. Instead, it felt like standing next to a blast furnace. Smith climbed out of the ball turret hatch and into the radio compartment. Through the flames and smoke, he could see that the radio equipment was destroyed. Wiring hung from the ceiling, some of it still sparking. The fire had burned through the fuselage wall in several places, creating holes large enough to stick an arm through. Wind roared through those holes at 200 miles per hour, feeding the fire with fresh oxygen. The intercom system was dead, so Smith had no way to know what was happening in other parts of the aircraft. He didn't know that 3 crew members in the front of the plane had already bailed out, convinced the bomber was going down. He didn't know that the pilot was still at the controls, fighting to keep the damaged aircraft in formation. He didn't know that the top turret gunner had been wounded by shrapnel. All Smith knew was that the plane was on fire, and if somebody didn't do something about it immediately, they were all going to die. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from its wall mount and aimed it at the flames covering the radio equipment. The extinguisher produced a white cloud of carbon dioxide that knocked down some of the fire but didn't eliminate it. The flames kept coming back, fed by fuel that continued leaking from the ruptured lines. That's when Smith heard movement from the tail section. Through the smoke, he saw someone crawling forward. It was Roy Gibson, the tail gunner, pulling himself along the floor. Gibson's flight suit was soaked with blood. He'd been hit in the back by shrapnel or bullets during the fighter attack and was trying to reach the front of the aircraft where the other crew members might be able to help him. Smith dropped the fire extinguisher and crawled back to Gibson. The tail gunner's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Blood pooled on the floor beneath him. Smith rolled Gibson onto his side to keep him from drowning in his own blood, pulled a morphine syrette from the first aid kit, and jabbed it into Gibson's thigh through the flight suit. The morphine would help with the pain, but Gibson needed real medical attention, and he needed it soon. Smith had about 3 seconds to process this situation before he heard the distinctive sound of a German fighter lining up for another attack run. Through one of the holes burned in the fuselage, he could see a Focke-Wulf 190 approaching from 6 o'clock level, closing fast. The bomber's defensive guns should have engaged the fighter. The tail guns should have fired. The waist guns should have fired. But Gibson was wounded and lying on the floor, and the waist gunners had bailed out when the fire started. Nobody was shooting back. Smith left Gibson on the floor, grabbed one of the waist gun positions, and swung the .50 caliber Browning toward the approaching fighter. The gun was already loaded, already charged. He pressed the trigger and sent a long burst of tracers toward the German pilot. The fighter peeled off and climbed away, either taking hits or deciding that attacking a burning bomber wasn't worth getting shot down. Smith released the waist gun and went back to fighting the fire. The extinguisher he'd been using was empty, so he grabbed a second one from the waist section. This one lasted about 20 seconds before it too ran dry. The fire was still burning. He tried a third extinguisher. Same result. The fire kept spreading. Smith realized the fire extinguishers weren't going to work. The fuel leak was continuous, and as long as fuel kept spraying onto hot metal, the fire would keep reigniting. He needed a different approach. He wrapped his sweater around his face as a makeshift filter against the smoke and crawled into the radio compartment. The fire had burned several large holes through the fuselage wall. Smith started grabbing everything that was burning and throwing it out through those holes. Pieces of burning insulation, melted radio equipment, ammunition cans that were hot enough to cook off rounds. Anything that would feed the fire, he threw out of the airplane. The wind helped. The 200-mile-per-hour slipstream caught everything Smith threw and sucked it out into the sky. But the wind also kept feeding the fire with oxygen. It was a race to see whether Smith could remove the burning material faster than the fire could spread. Another German fighter appeared. Smith dropped what he was doing, grabbed the waist gun again, and fired at the approaching aircraft. The fighter broke off. Smith went back to fighting the fire. For the next 90 minutes, Smith alternated between 3 tasks: fight the fire by throwing burning debris out of the aircraft, man the waist guns when German fighters attacked, check on Gibson and reposition him to keep his airway clear. Back to the fire, back to the guns, back to Gibson. The fire had burned so hot that it melted aluminum structural members. Smith could see daylight through sections of the fuselage where the skin had burned away completely. He realized the aircraft's structural integrity was compromised. If the fuselage broke apart from heat damage, everyone still aboard would fall 20,000 feet into the Atlantic Ocean. He started throwing out everything that wasn't bolted down or actively burning. ammunition cans, toolboxes, personal equipment, anything heavy that might stress the weakened structure. Some of the ammunition cans weighed almost as much as Smith did, but adrenaline and desperation gave him strength he didn't normally possess. The fire finally started to die down, not because Smith had extinguished it, but because he'd thrown out almost everything that could burn. The fuel leak had either stopped or burned through its supply. The flames reduced to smouldering embers, then to smoke, then to nothing. Smith was covered in burns. His hands were blistered from handling hot metal. His lungs hurt from breathing smoke. His eyes stung. His muscles screamed from 90 minutes of continuous physical exertion at altitude. But the fire was out, Gibson was still alive, and the B-17 was still flying. He crawled forward through the aircraft to find out if anyone else had survived. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Johnson was fighting his own battle. The explosion had severed most of the control cables running through the radio compartment to the tail section. The rudder was barely responding. The elevators were sluggish. 2 of the 4 engines were damaged and producing reduced power. The intercom system was dead, so Johnson had no idea what was happening in the back of his aircraft. He just knew the plane was still flying, and as long as it stayed in the air, he was going to try to get it home. When Smith finally made it to the cockpit, Johnson nearly jumped out of his seat. The pilot had assumed everyone in the back of the aircraft was either dead or had bailed out. The last thing he expected was to see his ball turret gunner, covered in soot and burns, crawling through the bomb bay with a message that the fire was out and Gibson was alive. Johnson checked his instruments and did a quick calculation. They were over the Atlantic Ocean, about 90 miles from the English coast. The 2 working engines were producing barely enough power to maintain altitude. The damaged control surfaces were responding just enough to keep the aircraft roughly level. If nothing else broke, they might make it. They might. The formation had long since left them behind. Johnson's B-17 was flying alone, damaged, slow, and vulnerable. If German fighters found them now, they'd have no defensive support from other bombers and limited defensive fire from their own guns. Johnson pushed the throttles forward as far as he dared, coaxing every bit of speed from the damaged engines. The English coast appeared at 12:47. Johnson aimed for the first airfield he could find, which turned out to be RAF Predanach in Cornwall. He radioed ahead, told the tower he had a damaged aircraft with wounded aboard, and requested priority landing clearance. The tower cleared him to land immediately. Johnson lined up his approach, extended the landing gear, and hoped the wheels would lock into position with the hydraulic system damaged. The gear locked. He reduced power and brought the B-17 down for landing. The aircraft touched down at 13:03, rolled about 200 feet down the runway, and broke in half. The structural damage from the fire had weakened the fuselage more than anyone realized. The stress of landing was the final straw. The aircraft separated just aft of the radio compartment, exactly where the fire had burned through the most structural members. The front section skidded to a stop on the runway. The tail section tumbled end over end before coming to rest in the grass beside the runway. Ambulances and fire trucks raced toward both sections of the wreckage. Medical personnel pulled Gibson out of the tail section and loaded him onto a stretcher. They pulled Smith out of the front section. Johnson and the other surviving crew members climbed out on their own. Ground crews spent the next 3 hours counting damage. The B-17 had been hit by more than 3,500 bullets and pieces of shrapnel. The radio compartment was destroyed. The tail section was held to the rest of the aircraft by less than 20% of its size. Original structural connections. Multiple control cables were severed. 2 engines were damaged beyond repair. The ball turret had taken direct hits from 20mm cannon fire. By any reasonable assessment, the aircraft should have fallen apart in mid-air. It didn't, because one 32-year-old ball turret gunner refused to let it fall apart. Lieutenant Johnson wrote his after-action report that evening. He was specific about Smith's actions. The man had fought the fire alone for 90 minutes while also manning defensive guns and treating a wounded crew member. Without Smith's efforts, Johnson wrote, everyone still aboard the aircraft would have died. He recommended Smith for immediate recognition. The recommendation went up through channels faster than anyone expected. The 8th Air Force was taking heavy casualties in spring 1943, and morale was becoming a problem. A story about an enlisted man performing heroic actions on his first combat mission was exactly the kind of positive publicity the Air Force needed. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson travelled to Thurleigh Air Base to personally present Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith with the Medal of Honor. It was the first time an enlisted airman in the European theatre had received the award. President Franklin Roosevelt understood the public relations value of the ceremony and ordered full military honors. There was just one problem: nobody could find Smith. The award ceremony was scheduled for 1000 hours. Formation was called at 09:30. Every man in the 306th Bomb Group stood in ranks, waiting for the Secretary of War to arrive. Everyone except Smith. Officers searched the barracks. They checked the mess hall. They checked the flight line. They checked the pub in town where Smith spent most of his free time. Nothing. The guest of honor for the biggest medal ceremony at Thurleigh had completely disappeared. Someone finally found him in the mess hall kitchen, peeling potatoes. Smith had been late returning from pass 2 days earlier. As punishment, he'd been assigned to KP duty. The charge of quarters had written him up for a work detail that started at 0800 and ran until 1700. Smith showed up for his KP shift on time and started peeling potatoes. When someone told him he was supposed to be at a formation, Smith pointed out that he'd been assigned to KP and he was following his orders. They had to physically pull him out of the kitchen and march him to the formation, still wearing his KP apron with potato peels in his pockets. Secretary Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around Smith's neck and shook his hand while photographers captured the moment. Smith stood at attention, looking vaguely confused about why everyone was making such a fuss. After the ceremony, he went back to the kitchen to finish peeling potatoes. The Medal of Honor didn't change Smith's personality. He remained difficult to work with, argumentative, and generally unpopular among his fellow airmen. He flew more combat missions, but crews still requested other gunners when possible. His commanding officer noted in Smith's service record that while his bravery was unquestionable, his attitude remained a problem. In November 1943, Smith was late to a mission briefing. The offence normally would have resulted in extra duty or loss of privileges. But Smith was a Medal of Honor recipient, which complicated matters. His commanding officer made an unprecedented decision and demoted him from staff sergeant to private. It was the first and only time a Medal of Honor recipient had been formally demoted while still in active service. Smith completed his combat tour and returned to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces offered him a position as a gunnery instructor, but Smith declined. He wanted out of the military as soon as possible. He received his discharge in October 1944 and went back to Michigan. After the war, Smith lived quietly. He took a job working for the Veterans Administration. He married, had children, and rarely spoke about his military service. When reporters occasionally contacted him for interviews about the Medal of Honor, he declined. His children didn't know about the Saint-Nazaire mission until they were adults. Smith's Medal of Honor sat in a drawer, largely forgotten. Roy Gibson, the tail gunner Smith saved, recovered from his wounds and returned to flight status. He completed his combat tour and went home to his family in Ohio. Gibson wrote to Smith several times after the war, thanking him for saving his life. Smith never wrote back. Lieutenant Johnson also completed his tour and returned to Pennsylvania. He flew transport aircraft for the rest of the war and left the service in 1945. Johnson kept a photograph of his crew from the Saint-Nazaire mission. Smith is in the photograph, standing in the back row, looking directly at the camera with the same expression he wore throughout his military service, vaguely annoyed that someone was taking his picture. The B-17 that broke in half on the runway at RAF Predanak was scrapped for parts. The tail section was cut up and sent to scrap yards. The forward section sat at Predanak for several months before being towed away. ground crews at Predanak used pieces of the aircraft to repair other damaged bombers. Within a year, nothing remained of the plane that Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith refused to let fall out of the sky. Smith died in 1984 at the age of 73. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Medal of Honor in the final paragraph. The funeral was small, attended mostly by family. A few veterans from the local VFW post showed up to pay respects. The ceremony lasted 45 minutes. The Saint-Nazaire mission on May 1, 1943, had achieved its objective. The submarine pens took damage, though not enough to put them permanently out of commission. German repair crews had the facilities operational again within 2 weeks. The 8th Air Force would return to Saint-Nazaire multiple times over the next 2 years, each time losing bombers and crews to the intense defences. Of the 29 B-17 seconds that reached Saint-Nazaire that day, 3 were shot down over the target. 2 more crashed on the return flight. 1 landed in neutral Spain after running out of fuel. The rest made it back to England, though most required extensive repairs before flying again. The mission was classified as a tactical success, with acceptable losses. What made Smith's Medal of Honor significant wasn't just what he did on May 1, 1943. It was that he did it on his first mission, while the rest of his crew assumed he would be worthless under fire. The man nobody wanted to fly with turned out to be the man who saved their lives. The Army, Air Forces learned something from this. Personnel evaluations started paying more attention to performance under pressure, rather than just compatibility with fellow crew members. Gunnery school instructors began emphasizing that courage didn't correlate with personality. Some of the best combat performers were difficult, disagreeable, or socially awkward. That didn't make them bad airmen. Combat revealed character in unexpected ways. The quiet, popular guy might freeze when fighters attacked. The loud, obnoxious jerk might save everyone's lives. You couldn't predict who would perform until the shooting started. Smith proved this on his first mission. He climbed out of his ball turret into a burning aircraft, fought the fire with inadequate equipment, treated a wounded crewman with minimal supplies, manned defensive guns when fighters attacked, threw out hundreds of pounds of burning debris through holes in the fuselage, and kept working for 90 minutes straight without knowing if anyone else aboard was alive, or if the aircraft would hold together long enough to reach England. He did all of this at 23,000 feet, in temperatures 40 below zero, while breathing smoke and suffering from burns and exhaustion, with no communication and no way to know if his efforts would matter. He did it because the alternative was dying, and Smith decided he wasn't going to die that day. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.